This is Tom Duty, middle-aged American living in New Jersey near the Lincoln Tunnel. If you were to visit my website, you would type Howdy Doody into Google. You'll find the correct spelling of the famous puppet. You then combine Tom Duty in a Google search for my site. I'll be reading for LibriVox. With this recording, I am soliciting for a fellow LibriVox volunteer as editor. The LibriVox prescribes a way to use software record to one's PC or Mac or laptop of any kind and then upload to the internet specific formats, specific procedures. I am proposing an alternative, partly by necessity, partly because I think it's an advancement. So this is the YouTube way. I will record with Google Hangouts. It'll go automatically to YouTube in addition to my personal preference because it's easy. It also has nearly limitless recording time in the neighborhood of 8 hours. So once again, I am seeking a volunteer from LibriVox to edit this audio. I've been through this 4 times, each time tweaking the quality of my audio. So I can get through this text, I think, without making errors that need to be edited. So in other words, dear kind prospective editor, it is my belief that this audio will be able to be chopped off at the beginning, chopped off at the end, and be then up to you to format it properly for LibriVox. So thank you for listening. I hope you consider volunteering for LibriVox. In a minute, I will begin after a silence. Once I begin, I will be in the LibriVox regimented, compulsory script until I end. Chapter 6 of Celebrated Crimes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Duty, Celebrated Crimes, Volume 3, by Alexandre Dumas, translated by Mary Stewart. Chapter 6. The Queen came out of her room only in the evening to take her place at the window, which looked over the lake at the usual times. She saw the light in which henceforth her sole hope shined in the little house in Kinross. For a whole long month she had no other consolation than seeing it every night, fixed and faithful. At last, at the end of the time, and she was beginning to despair, seeing George Douglas again. One morning, on opening the window, she uttered a cry. Mary Satan ran to her. The Queen, without having strength to speak, showed her in the middle of the lake a tiny boat anchored, and in that boat little Douglas and George, who were absorbed in fishing, their favorite amusement. The young man arrived the day before, and as everyone was accustomed to unexpected returns, the sentinel had not even blown the horn, and the Queen had not known the last of her friends had come. However, she was 3 days yet without seeing this friend otherwise than she had just done. That is, on the lake, it is true that from morning till evening he did not leave that spot from which he could view the Queen's window, and the Queen herself, when to gaze at a wider horizon, she leaned her face against the bars. At last, one morning, on the 4th day, the Queen was awakened by a great noise of dogs and horns. She immediately ran to the window, and for a a prisoner. Everything is an event. And she saw William Douglas, who was embarking with the pack of hounds and some huntsmen. In fact, making a truce for the day with his gaoler's duties to enjoy a pleasure more in harmony with his rank and birth. He was going to hunt in the woods, which covered the last ridge of Ben Lomond, and which ever sinking died down on the banks of the lake. The queen trembled with delight, for she hoped that Lady Lochleven would maintain her ill will, and that then George would replace his brother. This hope was not disappointed. At the usual time, the queen heard the footsteps of those who were bringing her breakfast. The door opened, and she saw George Douglas enter, preceded by the servants who were carrying the dishes. George barely bowed, but the queen, warned by him not to be surprised at anything, returned his greeting with a disdainful air. Then the servants performed their task and went out as they were accustomed. At last the queen, "You are back again." Then George motioned with his finger, went to the door and listened, and all the servants had really gone away, and no one had remained to spy. Then, returning at more ease, and bowing respectfully, "Yes, madame," returned he, "the heaven has thanked I bring good news." "Oh, tell me quickly," cried the queen, "for staying in this castle is hell." "You knew that they came, did you not? And that they made me sign an abdication?" "Yes, madame," replied Douglas, "but we also knew that your signature had been obtained from you by violence alone, and our devotion to you, your majesty, is increasingly thereby, if possible. But after all, what have you done? The Satans and the Hamiltons, who are, as your majesty knows, your most faithful servants." Mary turned round, smiling, and put out her hand to Mary Satan. "Have already," continued George, "assembled their troops to keep themselves in readiness for the first signal. But as they would be sufficiently numerous to hold the country, we shall make our way directly to Dumbarton, whose governor is ours, and which by its position and its strength can hold out long enough against all the regent's troops to give to the full faithful hearts remaining to you time to come and join us." "Yes, yes," said the queen, "I see clearly that we shall do once we get out of this. But how do we get out?" "That is the occasion, madame," replied Douglas, "for which your majesty must call to your aid that courage which you have given such great proofs." "If I have need only the courage and coolness," replied the queen, "be easy, neither the one nor the other will fail me." "Here is a file," said George, giving Mary Satan that instrument which he judged unworthy to touch the queen's hands. "And this evening I shall bring your majesty cords to construct a ladder. You will cut through one of the bars of this window. It is only at a height of 20 feet. I shall come up to you as much to try it as to support you one of the garrisons in my pay. He will give us passage by the door It is his duty to guard, and you will be free. And when will that be? Cried the queen. We must wait for things, madame, replied Douglas. The first is to collect at Kinross an escort sufficient for your majesty's safety. The second, that the turn of night watch of Thomas Warden should happen to be at the isolated door, that which can reach without being seen. And how will you know that? Do you stay at the castle then? Alas, no, madame, replied George. At the castle I am useless, and even a dangerous friend to you, while once beyond the lake I can serve you in an effectual manner. How will you know when Warden's turn to mount guard has come? The weathercock in the north tower, instead of turning in the wind with the others, it will remain fixed against it. But how shall I be warned? Everything is already provided. For on the other side of the light which shines each night in little house in Kinross incessantly tells you that your friends keep watch for you. But when you would like to know if the hour of your deliverance approaches or recedes, in your turn place a light in this window. The other will immediately disappear. Then, placing your heart on your breast, count your heartbeats. If you reach the number 20 without light reappearing, nothing is yet settled. If you reach 10, the moment approaches. If the light does not leave you time to count beyond 5, your escape is fixed for the following night. If it appears no more, it is fixed for the same. Evening then the owl's cry, repeated thrice in the courtyard, will be the signal. Let down the ladder when you hear it. Oh, Douglas, cried the queen, you alone could foresee and calculate everything thus. Thank you. Thank you 100 times. And she gave him her hand to kiss. A vivid flushing of the young man's cheeks, but almost directly mastering his emotion, he kneeled down and restained the expression of love, of which he had once spoken to the queen, while promising her never more speak of it. He took the hand, and Mary extended and kissed it. With such respect that no one could have seen in his action anything but the homage and devotion and fidelity. Then, having bowed to the queen, he went out, that a long stay with her should not give rise to any suspicion. At the dinner hour, Douglas brought, as he had said, a partial cord. It was not enough, but when evening came, Mary Satan was and unroll it and let fall the end from the window, and George would fasten the remainder to it. The thing was done as arranged, and without any mishap, an hour after the hunters had returned. The following day George left the castle. The Queen and Mary Satan lost no time in settling about the rope ladder. It was finished on the third day. The same evening the Queen, in her impatience, and rather to assure herself of partisans' vigilance, that the hope at the time of her deliverance was so near, brought her lamp to the window. Immediately, and as George Douglas had told her, the light in the little house in Kinross disappeared. That queen then laid her hand on her heart and counted up to 22. Then the light reappeared, and they were ready for everything, but nothing was yet settled. For a week the queen thus questioned the light and her heartbeats without the number changing. At last, on the 8th day, she counted, only as far as 10. At the 11th, the light reappeared. The queen believed herself mistaken. She did not dare to hope what was announced. She withdrew the lamp and then at the end of a quarter of an hour showed it again. Her unknown correspondent understood it was his usual intelligence that a fresh trial was required of him, and the light in the little house disappeared. In its turn, Mary again questioned the pulsations of her heart, fast as it leaped. Before the 12th beat, the preposterous star was shining on the horizon. There was no longer any doubt. Everything was settled. Mary could not sleep that night. This persistency of her partisans inspired her with great to point of tears. The day came, and the Queen several times questioned her companion to assure herself that it was not all a dream. At every sound it seemed to her that the scheme on which her liberty hung was discovered, and when at breakfast and all dinner time William Douglas entered as usual, she hardly dare look at him, for fear of reading on her face the announcement that all was lost. In the evening the Queen again questioned the light, and it made the same answer. Nothing had altered. The beacon was always one of hope. For 4 days it thus continued to indicate the moment of escape was at hand. On everything in the fifth, before the Queen had counted 5 beats, the light reappeared. The Queen leaned upon Mary Satan. She was nearly fainting. Between dread and delight, her escape was fixed for the next evening. The Queen tried once more, and obtained the same reply. There was no longer any doubt. Everything was ready except the prisoner's, for it failed her for a moment, and if Mary Satan had not drawn up a seat in time, she would have fallen prone. But at first movement over, she collected herself as usual, and was stronger and more resolute than ever. Till midnight the Queen remained at her window, her eyes fixed on that star of good omen. At last Mary Satan persuaded her to go to bed, offering, if she had no wish to sleep, to read her some verses by M. Ronsard, or some chapters from Mère des Histories. But Mary had no desire now for any profane reading, and had her hour read, making the response as she would have done if she had present a mass said by a Catholic priest towards dawn. However, she grew drowsy, and as Mary Satan, for her part, was dropping with fatigue, she fell asleep directly in the armchair at the head of the Queen's bed. Next day she awoke, feeling some one tapping at her shoulder. It was the Queen, who had already risen. "Come and see, darling," said she. "Come and see the fine day God had given us. Oh, how alive is nature, and how happy I shall be to come more free among those plains and mountains. Decidedly, heaven is on our side." "Madame," replied Mary, "I would rather see the weather less fine. It would promise a darker night, and consider what need for darkness is not light." "Listen," said the Queen. "It is by this we are going to see if God is indeed for us. If the weather remains as it is, yes, you are right, he abandons us. But if it clouds over, oh, then, darling, this will be the certain proof of his protection, will it not?" Mary Satan smiled, nodding that of her adopted mistress's superstition. Then the Queen, incapable of remaining idle in her great preoccupation of mind, collected the few jewels and she had preserved, enclosed them in a casket, got ready for the evening a black dress in order to be still better hidden in the darkness, and these preparations made, she sat down again at the window, ceasingly carrying her eyes from the lake to the little house in Kinross, shut up and dumb as usual. The dinner hour arrived. The Queen was so happy that she received William Douglas with more goodwill than her wont, and it was with difficulty remaining seated, during which time the meal lasted. But she remained herself, and Douglas withdrew without seeming to have noticed her agitation. Scarcely had he gone, and Mary ran to the window. She had need for air. She gazed, devoured in advance those wide horizons which she was about to cross anew. It seemed to her, once at liberty, she would never again be shut up against the palace, but would wander about the countryside continually. Then, amid all these tremors of delight, from time to time she felt unexpectedly heavy at heart. She then turned around to Mary Satan, trying to fortify her strength with hers, and the young girl kept up her hopes, but rather than duty than from conviction. But slow as they seemed to the Queen, the hours yet passed. Toward the afternoon, some clouds floated across the sky, and the Queen remarked upon them joyfully to her companion. Mary Satan congratulated her upon them on the account of the imaginary omen that the Queen sought in them, but because the real importance that the weather should be cloudy and darkness might aid them in their fight, while the two prisoners were watching and billowing moving vapors. The hour of dinner arrived, but it was half an hour of constraint and dissimulation, the more painful that, no doubt, in return for the sort of goodwill shown him by the Queen in the morning, William Douglas thought himself obligated to turn to company of duties with fitting compliments, which compelled the Queen to take a more active part in the conversation than her preoccupation allowed her. But William Douglas did not see any way to observe this absence of mind, and all passed as at breakfast. Directly he had gone, the Queen ran to the window, and a few clouds which were chasing one another around the sky an hour before had thickened and spread all the blue and blotted out, to give place a hue dull as leaden as pewter. Mary Stuart's presentiments were thus realized. As to the little house in Kinross, which could still make out the dusk, it remained shut up and seemed deserted. The night fell, the light shone as usual, the Queen signaled it. Disappeared. Mary Stuart waited in vain. Everything remained in darkness. The escape was for the same evening. The Queen heard 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, and 10 o'clock strike successfully. At 10 o'clock, the sentinels were relieved. Mary Stuart heard the patrols pass beneath her window, the steps of the watch recede, and all returned to silence. Half an hour passed. Suddenly, an owl's cry sounded thrice. The Queen recognized George Douglas' signal, and supreme moment had come. In these circumstances, the Queen found all her strength revived. She signaled to Mary Satan to take away the bar and to fix the rope ladder. While putting out the lamp, she felt her way into the bedroom to seek the casket which contained her few remaining jewels. When she came back, George Douglas was already in the room. "All goes well, madame," said he. Your friends await on the other side of the lake. Thomas Warden watches at the postern, and God has sent us a dark night. The queen, without replying, gave him her hand. George bent his knee and carried this hand to his lips, but on touching it, he felt it cold and trembling. Madame, said he, in heaven's name, summon up your courage, and do not let yourself be downcast at such a moment. Our Lady of Good Help, murmured Satan, come to our aid. Summon to your spirit of kings, your ancestors, responded George, and for this moment, not in your resignation of a Christian, that you require, but the strength and resolution of a queen. Oh, Douglas, Douglas, cried Mary mournfully, a fortune teller predicted to me that I should die in prison and by a violent death. Has not the hour of the prediction arrived? Perhaps, George, but it is better to die as a queen than to live in an ancient castle culminated as a prison. You are right, George, the queen answered. But for a woman, the first step is everything. Forgive me. Then, after a moment's pause, come, she said, I am ready. George immediately went to the window, secured the ladder against the more firmly, then getting up on the sill and holding to the bars with one hand, he stretched out to the other to the queen, and then, resolute as he had been and had already set one foot on the window's ledge, then suddenly the cry, who goes there? Rang out at the foot of the tower. The queen sprang quickly back, partly instinctively and partly pushed by George, who, on the contrary, leaned out the window to see whence came this cry, which, thrice again renewed, remained thrice unanswered. And it was immediately followed by a report and a flash of arms. At the same moment, the sentinel on duty on the tower blew his bugle, another set the alarm bell, and the cries, to arms, treason, treason, resounded through the castle. Yes, yes, treason, treason, cried Douglas, leaping down onto the room. Yes, the infamous warden had betrayed us. Then advancing to Mary, cold and motionless as a statue, George, courage, madame, said he, courage, whatever happen, a friend yet remains for you in the castle. It is little Douglas. Scarcely had he finished speaking when the door of the Queen's apartment opened, and William Douglas and Lady Lochleven, preceded by servants carrying torches and armed soldiers, appeared on the threshold. The room was immediately filled with people and light. Mother, said George, Douglas, pointing to his brother standing before Mary Stuart and protecting her body with his body, do you believe me now? Look! The old lady was for a moment speechless. Then, finding a word at last and taking a step forward, speak, George Douglas, cried she, speak and clear yourself at once of the charge which weighs heavy on your honor. Say but these words, A. Douglas was never faithless to his trust, and I believe you. Yes, mother, answered William A. Douglas, but he is not a Douglas. Mary, God grant my old age and strength needed to bear on the part of one of my sons such a fortune, and on the part of the other such an injury, exclaimed Lady Lochleven. O woman born under a fatal star, she went on addressing the queen, when will you cease to be in the devil's hands? an instrument of perdition and death of all who approach you. O ancient house of Lochleven, cursed be the hour when this enchantress crossed thy threshold. Do not say that, mother, do not say, cried George. Blessed be, on the contrary, the moment which provides that if there were Douglases who no longer remembered what they owe to their sovereigns, there would others who had never forgotten it. Douglas, Douglas, murmured Mary Stuart, did I not tell you that I, madame, said George. What did I reply then? That it was honor and duty in every faithful subject to your majesty to die for you. Well, die then, cried William Douglas, springing on his brother with a raised sword, while he leaped back, drew his, and with a moment, quick as he brought, eager as hatred, defending himself. But at the same moment Mary Stuart dotted between the two young people. Not another, Lord Douglas, said he, said she, sheath your sword, George, or if you use it, let be it go hence and against everyone. But your brother, I still have need of your life. Take care of it. My life, like my arm and my honor, is at your service, madame, and for the moment you command, I shall preserve it for you. With these words, rushing to the door with a violence and resolve which pretended everyone stopping him, back, cried he to the domestics who were barring the passage. Make way for young master of Douglas, or woe to you. Stop him, cried William. Seize him, dead or alive. Fire upon him. Kill him like a dog. Two of the three soldiers, not daring to disobey William, pretended to pursue his brother. Then some gunshots were heard, and a voice crying that George Douglas had thrown himself into the lake. And has he then escaped? Cried William. Mary Stuart breathed again. The old lady raised her hand to heaven. Yes, yes, murmured William. Yes, thank heaven for your son's flight, for the flight covers our entire house with shame. Counting from this hour, we shall be looked upon as accomplices of this treason. Have pity on me, William, cried Lady Lochleven, wringing her hands, having passion on your old mother. See you not that I am dying? With these words she fell backwards, pale and tottering. The steward and the servant supported her in their arms. I believe, my lord, Mary Satan, coming forward, that your mother has as much need of attention just now as the Queen has need for repose. Do you not consider it is time for you to withdraw? Yes, yes, said William. To give you time to spin fresh webs, I suppose, and I seek what fresh flies you can take in them. It is well, go on with your work, but you have just seen that it is not easy to deceive William Douglas. Play your game, I shall play mine. Then turning to the servants, go out, all of you, said he, and you, mother, come. The servants and the soldiers disobeyed, obeyed. Then William Douglas went out, last supporting Lady Lochleven, and the Queen heard him shut behind him and the double lock on the door of her prison. Scarcely was Mary alone and certain that she was no longer seen or heard, than all of her strength deserted her, and sinking into the armchair, she burst out sobbing. Indeed, all her courage had been needed to sustain her so far, and the sight of her enemies alone had given her this courage, but hardly had they gone than her situation appeared before her in all its fatal hardship. Dethroned a prisoner, without another friend, this impregnable castle, that a child to whom she had scarce given attention, and who was the sole and last thread attaching her past hopes to her hopes for the future, what reminded to Mary Stuart of her two thorns and her double power. Her name, that was all. Her name, with which free she had doubtless stirred Scotland, but which little by little was about to be effaced in the hearts of her adherents, and which, during lifetime oblivion, was to cover perhaps as with a shroud such an idea that was insupported of a soul as lofty as Mary Stuart's, and to an organization which, like that of the flowers, has needed before everything of air, light, and sun. Fortunately, there remained her best beloved of her four Marys, whom, always devoted and counseling, hastened to succor and comfort her. But this time it was no easy matter, and the Queen let her act and speak without answering her otherwise than with sobs and tears, when suddenly looking through the window to which she had drawn up her mistress's armchair, "The light," she cried, "Madame, the light." At the same time she raised the Queen, and with arms outstretched from her window she showed her the beacon, the eternal symbol of hope, highlighted in the midst of this dark night on Kinross Hill. There was no mistake possible. Not the star was shining in the sky. "Lord God, I give thee thanks," said the Queen, failing, falling to her knees and raising her arms to heaven with a gesture of gratitude. "Douglas has escaped, and my friends still keep watch." Then, after a fervent prayer, which restored to her a little strength, the Queen re-entered the room, and, tired out by her varied successive emotions, she slept in uneasy, agitated sleep, over which the indefatigable Mary Satan kept watch till daybreak. As William Douglas had said, from this time forward the Queen was a prisoner indeed, and permission to go down into the garden was no longer granted, but under the surveillance of two soldiers. But this annoyance seemed to her so unbearable that she preferred to give up her recreation, which, surrounded with such conditions, became a torture. So shut herself up in her apartments, finding a certain bitter and haughty pleasure is the very excess of her misfortune. End of chapter 6. And the preceding pause finishes the required regimen of LibriVox. I'm at Port Authority Bus Terminal, Starbucks. It is Halloween. This New York Lincoln. This has been Tom Duty, middle-aged American living in New Jersey near the Lincoln Tunnel. If you were to visit my website, you would type Howdy Doody into Google. You'll find the correct spelling of the famous puppet. You then combine Tom Duty in a Google search for my site. Thank you for listening. Have a good day, good evening, or restful night's sleep. Ciao.